Well, howdy, folks. Good to see y'all. Man, oh man, it's been a good week or two. I know summer's a starting. It's kind of spring here where I am, so we've got one night will be cold, and the next night won't be so cold. It's always the interesting part of the year. No mosquitoes yet either, thank goodness. Well, here I am enjoying this cup of coffee. Chicory coffee, of course. Sure is good. And I see a lot of you starting to circle around this fire, and it sure is nice. Summer, winter, fall, doesn't matter. Campfire is always the best. Well, you're here because we're telling stories, and tonight's no different. I want to tell you some more of that story by Max Brand. It's starting to get pretty interesting, isn't it? We got Dan in the corner because he ended up having to shoot someone. Well, I guess we're going to find out how that turns out. Now, so on to the Untamed, Book 2, TRAILIN the Night HORSEMAN by Max Brand. You know that. And we're on Chapter 10. The title of that being Sweet Adeline. So get yourself a seat. Let's sit on down, and here we go. Let's tell some of this story. You see, it starts again with Fatty Matthews. He came a-panting through the door. He was one of those men who have a leisurely build and a purely American desire for action, so that he was always hurrying and always puffing. If he mounted a horse, sweat started out every pore. If he swallowed a glass of red-eye, he breathed hard thereafter. Yet he was capable of great and sustained exertions, as many and many a man in the 3Bs could testify. He was ashamed of his fat. Imagine the soul of a bald eagle and the body of a Poland China sow, and you begin to have some idea of Fatty Matthews. Fat filled his boots as with water, and he made a squishing sound when he walked. Fat rolled along his jowls. Fat made his very forehead flabby. Fat almost buried his eyes. But nothing could conceal the hawk-like of his nose or the gleam of those half-buried eyes. His hair was short-cropped, gray, and stood out on end like bristles, and he was in the habit of using his panting breath in humming. I guess that concealed the puffing. So Fatty Matthews came through the doors, and his little, concealed eyes darted from face to face. Then he kneeled beside Jerry Strand. He was humming as he opened Jerry's shirt. He was humming as he pulled from his bag, for Fatty is almost as much doctor as he was marshal, cowpuncher, miner, gambler, a roll of cotton from another roll of bandages. The crowd grouped around him, fascinated, and at his direction some of them brought water and other raised and turned the body while the marshal made the bandages. Jerry Strand was unconscious. Fatty Matthews began to intersperse talk in his humming. "You was plugged from in front, my beauty, was you?" grunted Fatty, and then running the roll of bandage around the wounded man's chest, he hummed a bar of "Sweet Adeline, my Adeline, at night, dear heart, for you I pine." "Was Jerry looking the other way when he was spotted?" asked Fatty of the bystanders. "O'Brien, you seen it?" O'Brien cleared his throat. "I didn't see nothing," he said mildly, and began to mop his bar, which was already polished beyond belief. "Well," muttered Fatty Matthews, "all these birds get it, and Jerry was some overdue. Lou, you seen it?" "Yep." "Some drunken bum do it?" Lou leaned to the ear of the kneeling marshal and whispered briefly. Fatty opened his eyes and cursed until his panting forced him to break off and hum. "Beat him to the draw?" he said at length. "Jerry's gun was clean out before the stranger made a move," asserted Lou. "Well, that just ain't possible," murmured the deputy and hummed softly. "And all my dreams your fair face beams," he added sharply as he finished the bandaging. "Where'd he head for?" "No place," answered Lou. "He just now went out the door." The deputy swore again, but he added enlightened, "Going to plead self-defense, eh?" Big O'Brien leaned over the bar. "Listen, Fatty," he said earnestly, "there ain't no doubt of it. Jerry had his war paint on. He tried to kill this feller, Barry's wolf." "Wolf?" cut in the deputy marshal. "Well, dog, I guess," qualified the bartender. "I don't know. Anyway, Jerry made all the leads. This Barry simply done the finishing. I say, don't put this Barry under arrest. You want to keep him here for Max Strand?" Well, that's my business, growled Fatty. Hey, half a dozen of you gents, hook on to Jerry and take him up to a room. I'll be with you in a minute. And while his directions was being obeyed, he trotted heavily up the length of the bar room and outside the swinging doors. Outside, he found only one man, and in the act of mounting a black horse. A deputy marshal made straight for that man until a huge black dog appeared from nowhere, blocking his path. It was a silent dog, but its teeth and its eyes said enough to stop Fatty in full career. "Are you Barry?" he asked. "That's me. Come here, Bart." The big dog backed to the other side of the horse without shifting his eyes from the marshal. The latter gingerly approached the rider, who sat perfectly at ease in the saddle. Most apparently, he was in no haste to leave. "Barry," said the deputy, "don't make no play when I tell you who I am. I don't mean you no harm. But my name's Matthews, and—" He drew back the flap of his vest enough to show the glitter of his badge of office. All the time his little beady eyes watched Barry with bird-like intentness. The rider made not a move. And now Matthews noted more in detail the feminine slenderness of the man in the large, placid eyes. He stepped closer and dropped a confidential hand onto the pommel of the saddle. "Son," he muttered, "I hear you made a clean play inside. Now I know Strand and I know his way. He was in wrong. There ain't a doubt of it. And if I held you, you'd get clear of self-defense. So I ain't gonna lay a hand on you. You're free. But one more thing. You cut off here, see? And bear away north from the 3 Bs. You got a hoss that is, and believe me, you'll need him before you're through." He lowered his voice and his eyes bulged with terror of his tidings. "Feed him the leather. Ride to beat hell. Never stop while your hoss can raise a trot, and then slide off your hoss and get another, son. In 3 days, Max Strand will be on your trail." He stepped back and waved his arms. "Now vamos!" The black stallion flicked back its ears and winced from the outflung hands, but the rider remained imperturbed. "I never heard of Max Strand," said Barry. "You never heard of Max Strand?" echoed the other. "But I'd like to meet him," said Barry. The deputy marshal blinked his eyes rapidly as though he needed to clear his vision. "Son," he said hoarsely, "I can see your game, but don't make a fall play. If Max Strand gets you, he'll California you like a yearling. You don't have no chance. You've done for Jerry, there ain't a doubt of that, but Jerry to Mac is like a tame cat to a mountain lion. Lad, I can see you're a stranger to these parts, but ask me your questions and I'll tell you the best way to go." Well, Barry slipped from the saddle. He said, "I'd like to know the best place to put up my hoss." The deputy marshal was speechless. "But I suppose," went on Barry, "I can stable him over there at the hotel." Matthews pushed off his sombrero and rubbed his short fingers through his hair. Anger and amazement still choked him, but he controlled himself by a praiseworthy effort. "Barry," he said, "I don't make you out. Maybe you figure to wait till Max Strand gets to town before you leave. Maybe you think your hoss can outrun anything on 4 feet, and maybe it can. But listen to me. Max Strand ain't fast on a trail, but the point about him is that he never leaves it. You can go through rain and over rocks, but you can't never shake Max Strand. Not once he gets wind of you." "Thanks," returned the gentle-voiced stranger. "I guess maybe he'll be worth meeting." And so saying, he turned on his heel and walked calmly towards the big stables behind the hotel, and at his heels followed the black dog and the black horse. As for Deputy Marshal Matthews, he moistened his lips to whistle, but when he pursed them, not a sound came. He turned at length into the bar-room, and as he walked, his eye was vacant. He was humming brokenly, "Sweet Adeline, my Adeline, at night, dear heart, for you I pine." Inside, he took firm hold upon the bar with both pudgy hands. "O'Brien," he said, "red eye." He pushed away that small glass which the bartender sponged toward him and seized in its place a mighty water tumbler. "O'Brien," he explained, "I need strength, not encouragement." And filling the glass nearly to the brim, he downed that huge portion at a single draught. Chapter 11. the Buzzard. Most animals have their human counterparts, and in that room where Jerry Strand had fallen, a whimsical observer might have termed Jerry, with its tawny head, the lion, and O'Brien behind the bar, a shaggy bear, and the deputy marshal a wolverine, fat but dangerous. And here stood a man as ugly and hardened as a desert cayuse, and there was Dan Barry, sleek and supple as a panther. But among the rest, this whimsical observer must have noticed a fellow of prodigious height and negligible breadth, a structure of sinew and bones that promised to rattle in the wind, a long, narrow head, a nose like a beak, tiny eyes set close together and shining just like polished buttons, and a vast Adam's apple that rolled up and down that scraggy throat. He might have done for the spirit of famine in an old play, but every dweller of the mountain desert would have found an apt expression by calling him the Buzzard of the scene. Through his prodigious ugliness, he was known far and wide as Haw-Haw Langley. For an occasion, Langley laughed, and his laughter was an indescribable sound that lay somewhere between the braying of a mule and the cawing of a crow. But Haw-Haw Langley was usually silent, and he would sit for hours without words, twisting his head and making little pecking motions as his eyes fastened on one face after another. All the bitterness of the mountain desert was in Haw-Haw Langley. If his body looked like a buzzard, his soul was the soul of the vulture itself, and therefore he had followed the courses of Jerry Strand up and down the range. He stuffed his gourds with the fragments of the leader's food. He fed his soul with the dangers which Jerry Strand met and conquered. In the barroom, Haw-Haw Langley had stood turning his sharp little eyes from Jerry to Dan, and from Dan back to Strand. And when the shot was fired, something like a grin twisted his thin lips. And when that spot of red glowed on the breast of the staggering man, the eyes of Haw-Haw blazed as if with the reflection of a devouring fire. Afterwards, he lingered for a few minutes, making no effort to aid the fallen man. But when he had satisfied himself with the extent of the injury, and when he had noted the froth of bloody bubbles which stained the lips of Jerry Strand, Haw-Haw Langley turned and stalked from the room. His eyes were points of light, and his soul was crammed to repletion with ill tidings. At the hitching rack, he stepped into the saddle of a diminutive horse, whirled it into the street with a staggering jerk of the reins, and buried his spurs deep in that cow pony's flanks. The poor brute snorted and flirted its heels in the air, but Langley wrapped his long legs around the barrel of his mount and goaded it again. His smile, which began with the crack of Barry's gun in O'Brien's place, did not die out until he was many a mile away, headed far up through the mountains. But as he put peak after peak behind him, and as white light of the day diminished and the puffs of blue shadow drowned the valleys, the grin disappeared from Haw-Haw's face. He became keenly intent on his course until, having reached the very summit of a very tall hill, he came to a halt and peered down before him. It was nearly dusk by this time, and the eyes of an ordinary man could not distinguish a tree from a rock at any great distance. But it seemed that Haw-Haw was gifted with eyes extraordinaire. The buzzard at the top of its sky-towering circles does not see the brown carcass far below with more certainty than Haw-Haw sensed his direction. He waited only a few seconds before he rolled the rowel once along the scored flank of his Mustang, and then plunged down that slope at a reckless gallop. His destination was a hut, or rather a lean-to that pressed against the side of the mountain, a crazy structure with a single length of stovepipe leaning awry from the roof. And at the door of this house, Haw-Haw Langley drew rein and stepped to the ground. The interior of the hut was dark, but Haw-Haw stole with the caution of a wild Indian to the entrance and reconnoitered the interior, probing every shadowy corner with his glittering eye. For several long moments he continued this examination, and even when he was satisfied that there was no one in the place, he did not enter. But he moved back several paces from the door and swept the sides of the mountain with an uneasy eye. He made out a short distance from the door, a picketed horse, which now reared up its head from its miserable scattering of grass on which it fed, and it stared at the stranger. The animal must have bulked at least twice as large as the mount which had brought Langley to the mountainside, and it was muscled even out of proportion to its bulk. The head was so tremendously broad that it gave an almost square appearance. The neck, short and thick, the forelegs disproportionately small but very sturdy, and the whole animal was built on a slope towards the hindquarters, which seemed to equal in massiveness all the rest of the body. One would have said that the horse was a freak meant by nature for the climbing of hills, and to glance at it, no man could suppose that those ponderous limbs might be moved into a gallop. However, Ha-Ha Langley well knew the powers of that ugly beast, and he even made a detour and walked about the horse to view it more closely. Now he again surveyed the darkening landscape and then turned once more to the house. This time he entered with the boldness of a possessor approaching the hearth. He lighted a match and with this ignited a lantern hanging from the wall to the right of the door. The furnishings of the dwelling were primitive beyond compare. There was no sign of a chair. A huddle of blankets on the bare boards of the floor made a bed, and a saddle hung by one stirrup on one side, and on the other side leaned the skins of bobcats, lynx, and coyotes on their stretching and drying boards. Ha-Ha took down the lantern and examined the pelts. The animals had been skinned with the utmost dexterity. As far as he could see, the hides had not been marred in a single place by the slip of a knife, nor were there any bloodstains to attest to hurried work or careless shooting in the first place. The inner surfaces shone with the pure white of old parchment. But Ha-Ha gave his chief attention to the legs and the heads of the skins, for these were the works where carelessness or stupidity with the knife were sure to show. But the work was perfect in every respect, until even the critical Ha-Ha Langley was forced to step back and shake his head in admiration. He continued his survey of the room. In one corner stood a rifle and a shotgun. In another was a pile of provisions, bacon, flour, salt, meal, and little else. Spices and condiments were apparently unknown to this hermit, nor was there even the inevitable coffee, nor any of the molasses or other sweets which the tongue of the desert mountaineer cannot resist. Flour, meat, and water, it seemed, made up the entire fare of the trapper. For cookery, there was an unboarded space in the very center of the floor with a number of rocks grouped around the hole and blackened with soot. The smoke must rise, therefore, and escape through that small hole in the center of the roof. The length of stovepipe which showed on the roof must have been simply the inhabitor's idea of giving the last delicate touch of civilization. It was like a tassel to the cap of a Turk. As Ha-Ha's observations reached this point, his sharp ear caught the faint whinny of the big horse outside. He started like one caught in a guilty act and sprung to the lantern. However, with his hands upon it, he thought better of it, and he placed the light against the wall. Then he turned to the entrance and looked anxiously up the hillside. What he saw was a form grotesque beyond belief. It seemed to be some gigantic wild beast, mountain lion or great bear, though of size beyond credence, which slowly sprawled down the slope, walking erect upon its hind feet with its forelegs stretched out horizontal, as if it were warning all who might behold it away from it. Ha-Ha grew pale and involuntarily reached for his gun as he first beheld this apparition. But instantly he saw the truth. It was a man who carried a burden down the mountainside. The burden was the carcass of a bear. The man had drawn his forelegs over his shoulders, the jutting elbows making what seemed to be the outstretched arms, and above the head of the burden bearer, the great head of the bear. As the man came closer, the animal's head flopped to one side, and a red tongue lolled from its mouth. Ha-Ha Langley moved back step by step through the cabin until his shoulders struck the opposite wall, and at the same time Mac Strand entered the room. He had no ear for his visitor's hail, but cast his burden to the floor. It dropped with a shock that shook the house, from the rattling stovepipe to the crackling boards, and for a moment Mac Strand regarded his prey. Then he stooped and drew open the great jaws. The mouth within was not so red as the bloody hands of Mac Strand, and the big white fangs, for some reason, did not seem terrible in comparison with the hunter. Having completed his survey, he turned slowly upon Ha-Ha Langley and lowered his eyebrows to stare. So doing, the light for the first time struck full upon his face. Ha-Ha Langley bit his thin lips and his eyes widened almost to the normal. For the ugliness of Mac Strand was that most terrible species of ugliness, not disfigured features, but a discord which pervaded the man and came from within him, like a sound. Feature by feature, his face was not ugly. The mouth was very large, to be sure, and the jaw too heavily square, and the nose needed somewhat greater length and less width for its real comeliness. The eyes were truly fine, being very large and black, though when Mac Strand lowered his bush of brows, his eyes were practically reduced to gleams of light, the consequent shadow. There was a sharp angle to his forehead, the lines of it meeting in the center and shelving up and down. One felt unpleasantly that there had been heavy muscles overlaying that forehead. One felt that to the touch it would be a pad of flesh, and it gave to Mac Strand more than any other feature a peculiar impression of resistless power. In the catalogue of his features, indeed, there was nothing severely objectionable, but out of it came a feeling of too much strength. A glance at his body reassured the first thought. It was not normal. His shirt bulged tightly at the shoulders with muscles. He was not tall, inches shorter than his brother Jerry, for instance, but the bulk of his body was incredible. His torso was a veritable barrel that bulged out both in the chest and at the back, and even the tremendous thighs of Mac Strand were perceptibly bowed out by the weight which they had to carry. And there was about his management of his arms a peculiar awkwardness which only the very strongest of men exhibit, as if they are burdened by the weight of their mere dangling hands. This giant, having placed his eyes in shadow, peered for a long moment at Ha-Ha Langley. But very soon his glance began to waver. It flashed towards the wall. It came back and rested upon Langley again. He was like a dog, restless under a steady stare. And as Ha-Ha Langley noted, there was a glitter of joy came in his beady eyes. "You're Jerry's man," said Mac Strand at length. There was about his voice that same fleshy quality that was in his face. It came literally from his stomach, and it made a peculiar rustling sound such as comes after one has eaten sticky, sweet things. People could listen to that voice of Mac Strand and forget that he was speaking words. The articulation ran together in sort of a glutinous mass. "I'm a friend of Jerry's," said the other. "I'm Langley." The big man outstretched his hand. The hair grew black down to the knuckles. The blood of the bear still streaked it. It was large enough to be an organism with independent life. But when Langley, with some misgivings, trusted his own bony fingers within that grasp, in was only as if something fleshy, soft, and bloodless had closed over him. When the hand was released, he rubbed it covertly against his trouser leg. To remove dirt? Restore the circulation? He did not know why. "Who's bothering Jerry?" asked Mac Strand. "And where is he?" He went to the wall without waiting for an answer and took down the saddle. Now, the cowpuncher's saddle is a heavy mass of leather and steel and wood, and the saddle of Mac Strand was far larger than the ordinary. Yet he took down that saddle as one might remove a card from a rack. Ha-Ha Langley moved towards the door to give himself a free space for exit. "Jerry's hurt," he said, and he watched. There was a ripple of pain on the face of Mac Strand. "Hoss kicked him? Fall on him?" he asked. "It weren't a hoss." "A cow?" "It weren't no cow. It weren't no animal." Mac Strand faced fully upon Langley. When he spoke, it seemed as if it were difficult for him to manage his lips. They lifted an appreciable space before there was any sound. "What was it? A man?" Langley edged back towards the door. With what? A gun? And Langley saw the danger that was coming even before Mac Strand had moved. He gave a shrill yelp of terror and whirled and sprang for the open, but Mac Strand sprang after him and reached. His whole body seemed to stretch like an elastic thing, and his arm grew longer. The hand fastened on the back of Langley plucked him up and jammed him against the wall. Ha-ha crumpled to the floor. He had gasped. "It weren't me, Mac. For God's sake, it weren't me." His face was a study. There was abject terror in it, and yet there was also a sort of grisly joy, and his eyes feasted on the silent agony of Mac Strand. "Where?" asked Mac Strand. "Mac," pleaded the vulture, who cringed on the floor, "gimme your word ain't gonna hold it agin me." "Tell me," said the other, and he framed the face of the vulture between his large hands. If he pressed the heels of those hands together, bones would snap, and Ha-Ha Langley knew it. And yet nothing but a wild delight could set the glimmer in his little eyes, just as nothing but a palsy of terror could have set his limbs twitching so. "Who shot him from behind?" demanded the giant. "It weren't from behind," croaked the bearer of ill tidings. "It was from the front." "While he wasn't looking?" "No, he was beat to the draw." "You're lying to me," said Mac Strand slowly. "So help me God," cried Langley. "Who done it?" "A little feller. He ain't half as big as me. He's got a voice like Kitty Jackson, the schoolmarm, and he's got eyes like a starved pup. It was him that done it." The eyes of Mac Strand grew vaguely meditative. "Nope," he mused in answer to his own thoughts. "I won't use no rope. I'll use my hands. Where'd the bullet land?" A fresh agony of trembling shook Langley, and a fresh sparkle came in its place. "Betwixt his ribs, Mac, and right on through, and it came out his back." But there was not an answering tremor in Mac Strand. He let his hands fall away from the face of the vulture, and he caught up the saddle. Langley straightened himself. He peered anxiously at Strand, as if he feared to miss something. "I don't know whether he's living right now or not," suggested Ha-Ha. But Mac Strand was already striding through the door. Sweat was pouring from the lather-flacked bodies of their horses when they drew rein, at last, at the goal of their long, fierce ride, and Ha-Ha slunk behind the broad form of Mac Strand when the latter strode into the hotel. Then the two started for the room in which, they were told, lay Jerry Strand. "There he is," whispered Ha-Ha as they reached the head of the stairs. "The door's open. If he was dead, the door would be closed, most like." They stood in the hall and looked in upon a strange picture. For flat in that bed lay Jerry Strand, his face very white, oddly thin, and over him leaned the man who had shot him down. They heard Dan Barry's soft, gentle voice querying, "How you feeling now, partner?" He leaned close beside the others, his fingers upon the wrist of Jerry. "A pile better," muttered Jerry. "Seems like I got more than fighting chance to pull through now." "Just you keep lying there quiet," advised Dan Barry, "and don't stir around none. Don't start no worrying. You're going to live as long as you don't lose no more blood. You keep your thoughts quiet. They ain't no cause for you to do nothing but just keep your eyes closed and breathe. Think of yaller sunshine and green grass in the spring, and the wind lazy in the clouds around the sky. That's all you got to think about. Just keep quiet, partner. It's easy to do it now that you're with me. Seems like there's a pile of strength running into me from the tips of your fingers, my friend. And I was some fool to start that fight with you, Barry." "Ah, just forget all that," murmured the other, "and keep your voice down. I've forgot it. You forget it. It ain't never happened." "What's it mean?" frowned Mac Strand, whispering to Ha-Ha. The eyes of the latter glittered like beads. "That's him that shot Jerry," said Ha-Ha. "Him!" "Hell!" snarled Mac Strand and went through the door. At the first sound of his heavy footfall, the head of Barry raised and turned in a light, swift movement. The next instant he was on his feet. A moment before his face had been as gentle as that of a mother leaning over a sick child, but one glimpse of the threat in the contorted brows of Mac Strand set a gleam in his own eye. An answer as distinct as the click of metal upon metal. Not a single word had been said, but Jerry, who had lain with his eyes closed, seemed to sense a change in the atmosphere of peace which had enwrapped him the moment before. His eyes flashed open and he saw his burly brother. But Mac Strand had no eye for any saving Dan Barry. "Are you the creeping, sneaking snake that done this?" "You got me figured right," answered Dan coldly. "Then by God," began the roaring voice of Mac. But Jerry Strand stirred wildly on the bed. "Mac," he called, "Mac." His voice went suddenly horribly thick, a bubbling liquid sound. "For God's sake, Mac." He had reared himself up on one elbow, his arm stretched out to his brother, and then a foam of crimson stood on his lips. "Mac, don't pull no gun. It was me that was in wrong." And then he fell back to the bed and into the arms of Mac, who was beside him, moaning. "Buck up, Jerry. Talk to me, boy." "Mac, you finished the job," came the husky whisper. Mac Strand raised his head and his terrible eyes fixed upon Dan Barry, and there was no pity in the face of the other. The first threat had wiped every vestige of human tenderness out of his eyes, and now, with something like a sneer on his lips, and with a glimmer of yellow light in his eyes, he was backing towards the door, and noiselessly as a shadow, he slipped out and he was gone. Chapter 12, Finesse. Now, a man talks because he's drunk or lonesome. Now, a girl talks because that's her way of taking exercise. This was a maximum of Buck Daniels, and Buck Daniels knew a great deal about women, you see, as many a schoolmarm and many a rancher's daughter of the mountain desert could testify. Also, Buck Daniels said of women, it ain't what you say to 'em so much as the tune you put to it. And now he sat this day in O'Brien's hotel dining room. It was the lazy and idle hour between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, and since the men of the mountain desert eat promptly at 6, 12, and 6, there was not a soul in this room when he entered, nor was there a hint of eating utensils on the tables. Nevertheless, Buck Daniels was not dismayed. He selected a corner table by instinct and smote upon the surface with the flat of his hand. It made a report like the spout of a .45. Heavy footsteps approached, a door flung open, and a cross-eyed slattern stood in the opening. At the sight of Buck Daniels sitting with his hands on his hips and his sombrero pushed back to a good-natured distance on his head, the lady puffed with rage. "What in hell do you think this is?" bellowed the gentle creature, and the tone echoed heavily back from all 4 walls. "You're 3 hours late, and you get no chuck here. On your way, stranger." Buck Daniels elevated himself slowly from the chair and stood at his full height. With a motion fully as deliberate, he removed his sombrero and bowed to such a depth that the brim of the hat brushed the floor. "Lady," he said humbly, "I was thinking that some gent run this here eatin' place, which if you'll excuse me half a minute, I'll ramble outside and sluice off some of the dust. If I'd known you was here, I wouldn't have thought of coming in here like this." The lady with the defective eyes glared fiercely at him. Her judgment wavered 2 ways. Now, her first inclination was to hold that this fellow was jibing at her covertly, and she followed her original impulse far enough to grab a neighboring sugar bowl in a large, capable hand. A second and more merciful thought entered her brain and stole slowly through it like a faint echo in a great cave. "You don't have to make yourself pretty to talk to me," she said thoughtfully. "But if you're here for chow, you're just too late." "Ma'am," said Buck Daniels instantly, "when I come in here I was hungry enough to eat nails. But I'll forget about chuck if you'll sit down and chin with me for a while." The large hand of the cross-eyed lady stole out once more and rested upon that sugar bowl. "Do you mind saying that over again?" she queried. "Lonesomeness is worse than hunger," said Buck Daniels, and he met her gaze steadily with his black eyes. The hand released the sugar bowl once more, and something resembling color stole into the brown cheeks of the maiden. She said, relentingly, "Maybe you been off by yourself mining, stranger." Buck Daniels drew a long breath. "Mines?" he said, and then he laughed bitterly. That was all I've been doing, he began darkly, and then he stopped. The waitress started. Maybe this here is my last chance to get Chuck for days and days. Well, let it go. If I stayed here with you, I'd be talking too much. He turned slowly towards the door. His step was very slow indeed. Wait a minute. There ain't any call for that play. If you're in wrong somewhere, well, stranger, just take that chair and I'll have some ham in front of you just inside of a minute. She had slammed through the door before Buck turned, and he sat down, smiling pleasantly to himself. Half of a mirror decorated the wall beside his table, and into this Buck peered. His black locks were sadly disarrayed, and he combed them into some semblance of order with his fingers. He had hardly finished this task when the door was kicked open with such force that it whacked against the wall, and the waitress appeared with an armful of steaming food. Before Buck's widening eyes, she swiftly set forth an array of bread, butter in chunks, a crisp, French fried potatoes, a large slab of ham on one plate, and several fried eggs on another, and above all, there was a mighty pewter cup of coffee, blacker than the heart of night. Yearning seized upon Buck Daniels, but policy was stronger than hunger in his subtle mind. He rose again. He drew forth the chair opposite his own. "Ma'am," said Buck Daniels, "ain't you going to favor me by sitting down?" The lady blinked her own focused eyes. "Ain't I what?" she was finally able to say. "I know," said Buck Daniels swiftly, "that you're terribly busy, which you ain't got time to waste on a stranger like me." She turned upon Buck those uncertain and wistful eyes. It was a generous face. Mouth, cheekbones, and jaw were of vast proportions, while the forehead, eyes, and nose were remarkably diminutive. Her glance lowered to the floor. She shrugged her wide shoulders and began to wipe the vestiges of dishwater from her freckled hands. "You men are terrible foolish," she said. "There ain't no telling what you mean by what you say." And she sank slowly into the chair. It gave voice in sharp protest at her weight. Buck Daniels retreated to the opposite side of the table and took his place. "Ma'am," he began, "don't I look honest?" So saying, he slid half a dozen eggs and a piece of bacon from the platter to his plate. "I don't know," said the maiden, with one eye upon him and the other plunging into the future. "There ain't no trusting of men. Take 'em by the lot, and they're awful forgetful." "If you knowed me better," said Buck sadly, disposing of a slab of bread spread thick with pale butter and following this with a pile of fried potatoes, acutely balanced on his knife. "If you knowed me better, ma'am, you wouldn't have no suspicions." "And what might it be that you been doing?" asked the girl. Buck Daniels paused in his attack on the food and stared at her. He quoted deftly from a magazine which had fallen once in his way. "Some day maybe I can tell you. There's something about your eyes that tells me you don't understand." At the mention of her eyes, the waitress blinked and stiffened in her chair, while a huge red fist balled itself in readiness for action. But the expression of Buck Daniels was as blandly open as a smile of infancy. The lady relaxed, and an unmistakable blush tinged her nose with color. "It ain't after my nature to be asking questions," she announced. "You don't have to tell me no more'n you want to." "Thanks," said Buck instantly. "I knew you was that kind. I ain't hard," he went on to smoothly. "To tell a lady when you see one, I can tell you this much to start with. I'm looking for a quiet town where I can settle down permanent. As far as I can see, Brownsville looks sort of quiet to me." So saying, he disposed of the rest of his food by an act akin to legerdemain, and then fastened a keen eye upon this lady. She was in the midst of a struggle of some sort, but she could not keep the truth from her tongue. "Take it by and large," she said at length. "Brownsville is as peaceable as most, but just now, stranger, it's all set for a big bust." She turned heavily in her chair and glanced about the room. Then she faced Daniels once more and cupped her hands about her mouth. "Stranger," she said in a stage whisper, "Mac Strand is in town." The eyes of Buck Daniels wandered. "Don't you know him?" she asked. "Nope." "Never heard of him?" "Nope." "Well," sighed the waitress, "you've had some luck in your life. Take a cross between a bulldog and a mustang and a mountain lion, and that's Mac Strand. and he's in town and he's here for killing. You don't say, ma'am, and why don't they lock him up? Because he ain't done nothing yet to be locked up about. That's the way with him, and when he does a thing, he always makes the man he's after pull his gun first. Smart? Well, I'll say he's just like an Injun, that Mac Strand. Well, who's he after? That feller that plugged his brother Jerry. Kind of looks like he had a reason for killing then. Nope. Jerry had it coming to him. He was always raising trouble, Jerry was, and this time he pulled his gun first. Everybody seen him. He run into a gunman? Gunman, she laughed heartily. Partner, if it wasn't for something funny about his eyes, I wouldn't be no more afraid of that gunman than I am of a tabby cat. And me, a weak woman. The quietest looking sort that ever come to Brownsville, but there's something queer about him. He knows that Mac Strand is here in town. He knows that Mac Strand is waiting for Jerry to die. He knows that when Jerry dies, Mac will be out for a killing. And this here stranger is just sitting around and waiting to be killed. Can you beat that? But Buck Daniels had grown strangely excited. What did you say there was about his eyes? He asked sharply. She grew suddenly suspicious. Do you know him? No, but you was talking about his eyes. I don't know what it is. I ain't the only one that's seen it. There ain't no words you can put to it. It's just there, and that's all. The voice of Buck Daniels fell to a whisper. It's sort of fire, he suggested. Ain't it kind of a light behind his eyes? But the waitress stared at him in amazement. Fire? Fire? A light behind his eyes? My friend, are you trying to string me? What's his name? I don't know. Ma'am, said Daniels, rising hastily, here's $1 if you'll take me to him. You don't need no guide, she replied. Listen to that, will you? And as he hearkened obediently, Buck Daniels heard a strain of whistling, needle sharp with distance. That's him, nodded the woman. He's always going about whistling himself. Kind of a nut he is. It's him, cried Buck Daniels. It's him. And with this ungrammatical burst of joy, he bolted from the room. Well, there you go, friends. We got another fight going on, it seems like, next. Old Mac Strand's going to come after Whistlin Dan. Who knows how this is going to go down? Well, maybe Jerry won't die after all. We'll just have to wait and see. And by golly, looking forward to the next time we get together, and I'll read you some more of this story. It's getting to be pretty good, ain't it? Well, it's been a good long night tonight, and we got more fun to have. So if you're going home early, I'll see you next time. And if you're not, you're sticking around with me, why, let's just stick around. And one way or another, I'll probably see you next time here around the campfire. Until then, this is Clay Steele. Good night.